in collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up on the programme this week, we'll hear all about Napoleon's connection with Ireland and discuss some of what are probably apocryphal stories about him in Irish folklore.
As you may know, sleeping sentries are very much a no-no and very likely to be shot for dereliction of duty. However, does Napoleon do this? No, he does not. He takes up the sentry's musket and stands guard himself.
And we'll talk to the Labour Inspectorate from the Ministry of Labour about protecting outdoor workers when the temperatures rise as they have this last week.
Temperature 36 degrees, and we have more than 57% humidity, then there should be no work.
Cyprus and Ireland have had close ties for many, many years. Last week, the Solonian bookshop was packed with people listening to my next guest, who was talking about Napoleon and Ireland. He is Professor Tom Bartlett. Tom, what is the connection? Is there a connection between Napoleon and Ireland?
Very much so. I tried to talk about three areas which would focus on that topic. The first is the historical record, that is, what Napoleon Bonaparte thought about Ireland as a possible destination for an invasion during the Napoleonic Wars, roughly from about 1796 to 1815.
But that was more to get at England via Ireland,
It was to get at England. Irish rebels or Irish insurgents had gone to Paris to seek out Bonaparte and to encourage him to send a French army to Ireland. Bonaparte went along with them. He impressed them with his determination to do this. But in the end, he was unable or unwilling to commit a large force to a very hazardous enterprise to get from France to Ireland. While the British Navy controlled the seas, it would have been pretty reckless. Anyway, a small expedition did take place, but it never actually landed in Ireland, had to turn back because of adverse weather. So that was something. So that's one area I look at, which is the historical record for which there are documents and for which on which people have written books and so on. But I'm more interested in the what would you call the legend of Napoleon after his death in Irish popular consciousness, in Irish popular culture. That is to say, I examine poetry written about Bonaparte during the 19th century in Ireland. I examine ballads composed in praise of Bonaparte during the 19th century. I focus on the large number of reenactments of Waterloo, various travelling shows that go around in the 19th century, recreating various incidents. And notable and very macabre one was a famous show which recreated Napoleon's deathbed scene, in which these models were put on a bed and with various suction pumps and compression tubes mimic the rise and fall of his chest and slight turning of his head. Not to everyone's taste, but it was a big hit in the 1840s. And also one or two novels were written about Napoleon in Ireland, so that the memory of Napoleon was kept alive, very much so in 19th century Ireland. And I looked then at also the folkloric record, and that's particularly interesting. There's a very large Irish folklore archive. In the 1930s, the Irish government had the brainwave of setting up a schools project, and school children were encouraged to write down on notebooks the local folklore under a series of headings. They were asked to find out about all this. So some 30,000 school exercise books were lodged with folklore, and they've been digitised now, and you can look up Napoleon Bonaparte. And it turns out there are quite a few stories about Napoleon Bonaparte.
Do tell me about the one at the post office.
Oh, I haven't got to that yet.
Oh, okay.
But the one that I like particularly, and as a historian, it's one that I particularly like, is the story of the sleeping sentry. That is, in French, it's called La Sentinelle Endormie, and it's about Napoleon after a big battle in Italy. He's won the battle, but there's always a risk of a counterattack, and his sentries are deployed while the rest of the army sleeps contentedly. And then Napoleon's restless, he gets up out of his bed and wanders out, and lo and behold, he finds a sentry fast asleep. Now, as you may know, sleeping sentries are very much a no-no and very likely to be shot for dereliction of duty. However, does Napoleon do this? No, he does not. He takes up the sentry's musket and stands guard himself while the sentry sleeps on. Now, this is a charming story, but it's designed to show how favourably people regarded Bonaparte. Interestingly, the story is in the Irish language from West Cork, as remote as you can get from Corsica in Europe. It also is very much in French folklore about Napoleon, La Sentinelle Endormie. It actually migrates across the Atlantic to the American Civil War, where the story of Abraham Lincoln spurring the sleeping sentry. And it's a fascinating way in which this motif, it seemed to be very appealing to popular culture everywhere throughout Europe. It's also in Poland and other parts of Europe. So Bonaparte had the legend of Bonaparte, the reality is rather different, obviously. But the legend was that he was a gentle ruler, encouraged familiarity with his men. He encouraged his men to address him as tu rather than vous, which again was a big deal. There was no flogging in Bonaparte's army, unlike in Wellington's army, and so on and so forth. So in these ways, through various spectacular displays, through various shows, and then at the turn of the 20th century, through film, Irish film was getting underway, and very often they took historic sort of events as a storyline for the film, and these films were produced in 1900, 1905, 1906 with Bonaparte, Theobald Wolfe Tone, the United Irishmen, Robert Emmet, all of which with no regard to historical accuracy, but they feature. So in those ways, even though Bonaparte had died in 1821, 80 years later, his image, his stories, the reality of Bonaparte and the legend of Bonaparte is alive and well. Which brings me, I suppose, to the GPO. The title of my talk was Bonaparte in the GPO in 1916. Now, your listeners may not be aware, but the General Post Office, the GPO in Dublin, was the headquarters of the Irish rebels in Easter week 1916. It's where Patrick Pearse was, the leader of the rebels. It was where James Connolly, the socialist leader, was with his men from the Irish Citizen Army. It's where they were ensconced during Easter week 1916. So, did Bonaparte have any impact on that? Well, what I try to show is that very many of the men there were admirers of Napoleon. And we know this because many of those who survived, 20, 30 years later, wrote detailed accounts of what they had done. And very many of them mentioned Bonaparte as just simply that we thought ourselves as brave as Bonaparte would write one. We thought I was reading a novel about Bonaparte on that particular day. And there's a number of references of that sort, which shows that Bonaparte was alive and well in their imaginations at any rate. So much for the men. What about the leaders? James Connolly, socialist icon, very much in the vanguard of European socialists, is an unlikely admirer of Napoleon. Napoleon was autocratic, anything but democratic. Certainly, he has no aspirations, there's no claim to any sort of socialist achievement. Nonetheless, Connolly admired Napoleon's sort of brio. He admired his decisiveness in dealing with the enemy. But most of all, Patrick Pearse, who was the leader of the rebels, seems to me to have been very much in thrall. I don't think the word's too strong. Very much obsessed with Napoleon Bonaparte. He ran his own school in Rathfarnham in County Dublin. And in the school, the school classrooms had little statues and images of Bonaparte and busts of Napoleon Bonaparte decorated the school. In his own office, he had a sort of a shrine to Napoleon. And his prized possession, so one of his contemporaries tells us, was nothing less than a lock of Napoleon's hair, which for prized guests he would produce with great reverence and allow them to gaze on it. He also was very much involved in a book called The Corsican. Now, the Corsican is now forgotten, but it was a compilation in diary form of some of Napoleon's statements, dispatches, letters. And it contrived to be a diary by Napoleon, even though it's a cut and paste job. The editor freely admits that. Patrick Pearse was very taken with this book, carried it around with him. There's one charming vignette where he's at a play in the Abbey Theatre, and in the interval, they're all outside, and Pearse is sitting there reading the Corsican. And this is commented on, that this seemed to be a sort of rather unusual thing to do if you're at the theatre, to have your nose in a book about Napoleon based on some of his sayings. And it struck me that I was reading through the book, some of the alleged sayings by Napoleon would have been music, I suppose, to Patrick Pearse's ears, because Pearse was, quote-unquote, Director of Military Operations. Very grand title. But he had no military experience whatsoever.
So did he assimilate Napoleon's military prowess, in a sense, to the way he approached things? Because it's very different talking about a fairly small rebel army and Napoleon's army. You can't always extrapolate the same methodology, can you?
You can't. Napoleon had a grand army, a huge army, 600,000 at one stage. The rebels numbered 1,600 at one stage. It's not so much that, is that Napoleon was a complete unknown. Someone who came from comfortable but modest background, from Corsica, an outsider, who went on to command half the world. And I think that was the inspiration, that someone chosen by destiny could achieve great things. He didn't need to have a massive army. Remember, Napoleon's major victories in the 1790s were in Italy, where with a tiny army he defeated comprehensively the Austrians and more or less captured all of Italy for France. This was, by any stretch of the imagination, a stunning victory. A tiny army overturned the Austrian Empire in Italy. And this meant that Napoleon, from being just another general, all of a sudden was this colossus that people aspired to emulate and were inspired by, I think.
I wonder how far you think that the tradition of folklore, poetry, music and so on in Ireland, for which it's so famous, played a part in all of this, because it sounds as if he was assimilated into Irish folk history, which was then passed from generation to generation and became, I was going to say godlike, not quite, but you know what I mean.
I think you're right. One of the central motifs in popular culture in Ireland, in terms of sort of resistance to English rule, from the 17th century on, one of the central motifs is the notion of deliverance from abroad. That there will come someone from abroad, possibly with an army. At one time this would have been Bonnie Prince Charlie, and at another time it might have been the Spanish. Then in the 18th century it would have been the French. But the notion of assistance from abroad was firmly embedded, and I think Bonaparte moves into that tradition. And this is what, and his memory, the memory of Bonaparte and the notion of assistance from abroad is kept alive through the 19th century via folklore, reenactments, ballads, poetry, and the occasional novel. That Napoleon was very much alive and well long after his death in Irish popular culture, and also in English popular culture as well. He was very much a feature in English popular culture as well. Bonaparte, he was a symbol of that, small people could overthrow mighty empires, and that was a powerful inspiration to people who wanted to change things and really couldn't see an easy way to do it, but they took inspiration from Bonaparte's exploits. Now, of course, what this meant, as I've tried to say, is that it meant ignoring inconvenient truths about Napoleon. That is, he had a very efficient secret police force, very strict censorship. He reinstalled the nobility in France. He reinstalled slavery after it had been abolished in the Caribbean. So there's a lot about Napoleon that doesn't sit too well with the liberal mentality. But all of that is pushed aside, that Bonaparte was somehow or other turned into a hero of the masses. Those who toiled, he would be the one who would bring them some sort of victory in the end. And I think Pearse drew inspiration from that. This book, The Corsican, was very, very dear to Pearse. And when he goes into the GPO, I think that he hoped that this would be the spark that would ignite insurrection in Ireland, and that he has a reference to our gallant allies from abroad, our gallant allies in Europe, that these gallant allies in 1916, they were presumably the Germans and the Turks and so on, who were allegedly on the side of the Irish rebels. But it was more the notion of assistance from abroad, rather than the specifics, because Pearse himself says at his court-martial, I couldn't care tuppence about Germany. Germany's nothing to me. I just couldn't be interested. It's the notion of Irish rebels had to have assistance from abroad. That's part of the DNA. It's part of what they're about. They need this assistance from abroad, whether it's in the 1740s, the 1840s, or 1916. And Bonaparte fitted into that whole feature very strongly.
Well, that is Professor Tom Bartlett talking about the connection between Napoleon Bonaparte and Ireland. Well, there have been two particularly hot topics in the news this week. The first is the Crans-Montana conference on Cyprus, and that has been going wild on social media, with the pro-solution and the rejectionists trading barbs as differing reports come out of the Swiss resort. President Anastasiades earlier this week said that he had put forward some new proposals, and at the same time we heard that the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was heading back to Switzerland to try and get the talks back on track. Meanwhile, here in Cyprus, the heat has been literally the weather. As temperatures absolutely soared over the last weekend, we had 3 deaths from heat stroke and warnings for people to look after elderly people in their neighbourhoods, and meanwhile, as many old people as possible who are vulnerable because they don't have air conditioning have been packing into the centres opened by municipalities where there's air conditioning and cool water. The other problem when the heat soars as it has is for people who work outdoors. The DEOC trade union said earlier this week that many employers were ignoring laws to protect employees working in extreme heat. The union said it had noticed that over the last 4 years, the system that the labour inspection services should be carrying out has failed miserably, they said, as the majority of employers fail to apply it. It said it would propose to the Council for Safety and Health at Work to issue a decree to ensure that legislation to protect workers from the impact of a heat wave is applied effectively. As things stand, during the summer months, employers are obliged to measure temperatures and humidity and monitor weather reports and meteorological forecasts and adjust their operations accordingly to protect their staff. Nevertheless, if you drive around the centre of Nicosia, you will still see workers on building sites in the full glare of the sun. And staying with the hot topic, Cyprus MEPs are in hot water after all 6 of them were among those who didn't attend the Prime Minister of Malta's address to the European Parliament, which was marking the end of Malta's EU presidency. EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker panned the Parliament because only 30 of their members, and there are 751 MEPs in total, showed up to listen to the Maltese Prime Minister. Cypriot MEP Eleni Theoharos said that small countries like Malta were shown contempt by the bigger members of the bloc. However, she was one of the ones who didn't show up, saying that the session had taken place too early in the morning and many parliamentary members had to attend other committees. Another Cypriot MEP, Tagis Hagigeorgiou, confirmed that he hadn't managed to be present either, but he said that in similar circumstances Cyprus fared no better, as if that was a good excuse. Juncker was furious. However, the Maltese Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, was smiling during the debate. Well, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have been undergoing a heat wave here in Cyprus, and one of the issues it's raised has been the welfare of people who work outdoors. The responsibility for ensuring that the proper decrees are followed comes with the Labour Inspection Department. They work with the Ministry of Labour, Welfare and Social Insurance. And joining us is Evangelitsa Tsoulofta. Evangelitsa, first, how easy is it for the Labour Inspection Department to ensure that employers are actually following the rules as they should?
Well, we should say that in addition to the publication of announcements and this year 2 announcements that were issued on the 8th and 26th of June. The first announcement was to warn, let's say, the employers, and the second announcement was issued to remind them about their obligations. Additional to this, the inspectors of the department conducts inspections to enforce the provision of the legislation and especially the provisions of the Code of Practice.
All right, what happens if an inspector goes to, for example, a building site and finds that the workers are still working under conditions in which they shouldn't be working? What can you do?
During the inspections, the inspectors, they take the necessary measures to enforce the legislation.
Yes, and but what are those measures?
Yes, these measures include the issue of a prohibition notice for the execution of the works, and this prohibition notice is issued where it is required according to the provisions of the legislation, as well as the issue of improvement notice. And of course, the inspector could make written or oral comments and suggestions, especially in cases where employers have been informed in the past but have not complied, or the breaches are serious. Then their prosecution is promoted.
Okay,
and in the case,
let me just ask you this: over the years, how many successful prosecutions have you had of people exploiting workers in these conditions? Because particularly foreign workers are not aware, are they, of what protection is offered by the law?
Well, now you mentioned the foreign workers. They are informed. They should be informed through their employers. I mean, all the employers are informed, and our department, in between other things, organize seminars and workshops in cooperation with employers' organizations, and we inform the employers about the provisions of the legislation.
But you don't inform the workers. Now, isn't it important, because if an employer is planning not to comply, he's hardly going to tell his workers, by the way, guys, if it goes above, 42, 43 degrees, I still have to pay you, but you're not allowed to work out in the open sun, I'll have to find you something else to do.
According to the legislation, it is the obligation of the employer to inform his employees. Of course, we also inform the employees through guides that we issue, and also other leaflets that everything is available on our website. And also, during the inspections, the inspectors inform the employees about their, let's say, rights and what are the obligations of their employer.
Do they also ask the employees whether or not the employer has informed them beforehand?
Yes, during the inspection we do this, and also we can collect this information through the representatives of the employees, which they are, according to the legislation, should be, let's say, elected. And
you're talking about the unions, because DEOC came out this week and said that they weren't happy with how this measure was being implemented or was working. They said it wasn't working. So I don't know what contact the ministry has with, for example, the unions to maybe come up with a solution that will avoid employers paying where they don't have to, but also, most importantly, protect the employees from, particularly, we've had, 3 people die of heat stroke in the last week. Although maybe younger people on construction sites are less likely to get heat stroke, they are at risk.
We should say here that since 2010 we didn't have any accident because of the thermal stress. So we are in a, always there is space for improvement, but things have been improved during the last years, and especially after the issue of the enforcement of the Code of Practice in 2014. Now, regarding the unions, the Ministry and the Department of Labour Inspection has a very good cooperation with them. And they take part in the technical committee that has been drawn up especially for this issue, for the thermal stress and for the code of practice. And we meet regularly with this technical committee, and we always discuss what are the problems and how we could improve them. And also we organize seminars and workshops with the unions, cooperation with the unions, or if they organize seminars, they invite us and we go and we give lectures. And it happened especially for this issue, for the thermal stress. So the unions are part of this tripartite, let's say, cooperation that our ministry has in place.
Okay, Evangelista, let's wrap it up. Let's inform people what their rights are. What actually is the set temperature and thermal stress level at which an employee is entitled to say to his employer, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to make me work in the sunshine, find me a job in the shade, and where's the water that you're supposed to provide for me? I think that's what, as far as I recall, used to be the code of practice. So what's the temperature? If they hear on the radio that today it's 43 degrees, can they work or not?
First thing, we should say that always the employer should assess the risk, and in case that he can organize the work that the workers could work under the shadow, he should do this.
Yes, we know that, but if the employee thinks he's not doing it, at what point is the employee entitled to go to his boss and say, you're breaking the law?
Okay, there is a specific table in the Code of Practice, and this specific table specifies in which temperature and the humidity rate the work should be stopped, or there should be breaks. I mean, I could give an example. For example, if we have 36 degrees, temperature 36 degrees, and we have more than 57% humidity, then there should be no work. This is what the table in the code mentions. So the employers should follow this table. That's why I said before that they have to measure the temperature and the humidity, and according to the result, they should take the appropriate technical or organizational measures.
Okay, one final question. A lot of people are not going to bother to look this up before they start their workers. Why don't all the local radio and TV stations and newspapers carry predictions of the weather, and then as it warms up to 10, 11 o'clock in the daytime, particularly the radio stations, all say, we're now at heat stress red, you should stop work? Because that would immediately mean that everybody would hear it and find out about it fast.
The reason that this code was enforced is because not all the workplaces have the same conditions and regarding the temperature and the humidity. Even if you are in the district of Nicosia, of Limassol, but you work in different places, the conditions are different. So it might be that in one workplace they should stop, and in another one They should not.
But
That's
the
why
point is that you're seriously expecting every employer in every individual, let's say, building site, and he may
Yes.
have 20, to take measurements? Has he
Yes.
got the equipment to take measurements? The logical thing would be to have at least something that says, you know, we're stress level red in Limassol today, stress level orange in Paphos, we're green up in the mountains, so that people then knew they better take their measurements and check.
and this is what the code provides, that each employer should have in every workplace, in every construction site, these instruments. And these instruments exist in the market and they are very cheap.
Every construction site that's visited, are they there?
Well, what I said before is that every year there is an improvement, and every year more and more employers have these instruments, and they measure.
But that means
the
that not
temperatures.
everybody does.
Of course, we know that not everybody follows the legislation or complies with the legislation. This is, I think, something that we all know it. Otherwise there wouldn't be any need to inspect and to enforce the legislation if everybody was in compliance with the legislation. So we have to keep working, keep inspecting.
We've been talking about the heat stress index, I think they call it in some countries, and it's been pretty damn high here in Nicosia, certainly, and the rest of Cyprus over the last week. Joining us to talk about it and the problems that are faced by workers outdoors from the Labour Inspectorate at the Ministry of Labour was Evangelitsa Tsulofta. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.